Hey guys, it's Christine, the Glambassador. So I have been racking my brain and trying to come up with some really clever way to start this video, and it's just not happening. So I'm just gonna dive right into it. But I want to have a little bit of a disclaimer on here and let you know that you are going to be coming into the multiverse of madness in my brain, vintage edition. And it's going to be really random and it's going to be more of a rant than anything. So I apologize. And also I want to say something to those people that comment on my videos that I talk too much. Buckle up or just go ahead and skip this one because this is going to be just me talking the whole time. Okay, so here we go. I joined TikTok about a month ago. And it's, I'm still very new to it. I still really don't understand everything that's going on. I'm Gen Xer and I don't understand these things. Anyway, it has caused a bit of an existential crisis for me because I'm really starting to realize that our, I guess, kind of phase of vintage is changing drastically, and utilizing the terms vintage and the definition of it, it's really starting to become very clear to me that we need to come up with a new term that better defines what we are and what our interests are. Let me explain. So, new on TikTok, I'm looking for other creators, other people to follow. So I go to, the search terms and I type in my normal vintage style or whatever. And what I'm finding are these young people who are doing get ready with me 90s style or my vintage 80s sweaters. And I have to tell you that was a lightsaber to my cold, dead Robert Smith loving heart. But the thing is, and it was frustrating, and I was starting to get really mad. I was really getting mad that I wasn't finding what I wanted because I was putting in my normal search terms. And then I realized I cannot get mad because they're not wrong. 80s and 90s are vintage. So let me get into, again, I apologize. This is going to be kind of random and you're in my brain right now and I'm sorry. It's not a great place to be sometimes. So last year I actually put together a blog post kind of defining vintage, and talking about descriptions for better communication. And the main purpose of that blog post was for, mostly for newcomers that were coming into the scene and wanted to understand better ways of searching for stuff. And so, defining vintage, defining retro, defining antique, and then getting into a little bit of the different styles. And I kind of want to talk about that a little bit here now, because as much as I am not a gatekeeper, I am not the one that is saying that, things have to be done a certain way or whatever. I believe that words have meaning and they matter and definitions matter. And I think it is really important to understand what those definitions are and to keep true to them. And also to understand when those parameters of the definitions change, based on, especially with vintage, based on age and era. So let me get into some of the definitions so you understand what I'm talking about. So when we talk about vintage, sorry, I've got my notes here on my iPad. So when we talk about vintage, we are talking about clothing, furniture, accessories, home decor, anything like that is made or produced more than 20 years ago. So it is now the year 2021. And so, yeah, that means the 1990s and even the 2000s is considered vintage. Anything that is over 100 years old is considered antique. Now, these terms, these definitions generally are based upon resale. So vintage reselling, clothing, accessories, home decor, furniture, all of that stuff. There is a definition for it for a reason, because you can't just call something vintage when, you know, it was made yesterday. Even if it has a certain style, that's retro, and I'm going to get into that in a second. Another thing about the word vintage and the definition of vintage that I found in a lot of my research was this kind of added element to it, that it said that when an item is described as vintage, should speak to the era in which it was produced, meaning that the article should exhibit the best of a certain quality or qualities associated with or belonging to that specific era. It should be somewhat representational and recognizable as belonging to the period in which it was made. So as far as clothing is concerned and furniture and all of that stuff, if it's just because it was made in that era, it absolutely could have been made in that era, but if it didn't really represent the style of that era, in resale terms, it shouldn't be called vintage. So I think that's important, because details matter, and you know, there were definitely certain elements of eras that, you know, you can look at something and go, yeah, that definitely was 1950s, that definitely was 40s, because it had that specific detail to it. So I think that is important, but again, I'm kind of digressing. So the term retro is something that I think is not being utilized enough. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of people are using the term vintage when what they really mean is retro. So the term retro, the prefix retro, is in reference to retrograde or retroactive, meaning backwards in Latin. So using the term retro for clothing simply means that it is a contemporary item that looks back at an era, that it gives a nod to it. The article itself was not made or produced in that bygone era, and it's not a modern reproduction. I'll get to that in a second. So it's not an authentic representation of a vintage garment. It is simply a nod to that era. And I truly believe that so many people, whether they know it or not, are using the term vintage for a style or for a look when they really mean retro. If you really want to get pedantic, and you know, I'm one to do that, vintage is not a style. It denotes an era. It denotes a time frame. So when people, you know, and I have definitely used this term vintage style. I use it a lot, mostly because I don't know what else to call it. When I'm calling like the encompassing vintage style of, you know, my look. I could definitely be more specific and say 1940s style, 1930s style, and I'm being a lot more conscious of that when I'm doing my hashtags and when I'm calling stuff for its specific era or look. But vintage is not a style. It denotes an era. It denotes a time period. Retro can be a style because it's not specific to an era, and it's not a reproduction. Reproduction means that a garment, I'm talking mostly about clothing, of course, a garment is utilized or made using a vintage pattern, or it is a replica or a representation of something that was made or produced in that era. So the details are there. Either the way that it was created, the way that it was made was similar to the way that it was made in that era. Retro is just simply a nod to the era. There's the you know, it may be synthetic fibers that they're using. It may be you know, they're using just a very small detail within a garment. There's a big difference between retro and reproduction and then vintage. Vintage denotes that it was actually a specific item that was made in that time period. Reproduction is a modern piece, but using the vintage pattern or vintage details to give a representation of what that item actually would have looked like in that era. And retro is a modern production that just gives a nod to the era. Okay, so back to what I'm, my little existential crisis that I'm having. So I want to give you a little bit of what my frame of reference is when it comes to the term vintage and, where I'm coming from in my brain. So I was born in 1976. My formative years were the 80s and 90s. I started dressing this way about 1992. So at that point, the far end of vintage was 1970s. That was how far it went. I lived in the 90s. That's when I started to start dressing in vintage. So 1970s is my frame of reference of the end of where vintage, kind of ends right there, is in the 70s. So the swing era, the swing revival, I should say, came about like late 90s. And that's when this style, the typically 1940s, 1950s style, really became big when I was growing up. And so I was already out of high school because I graduated in 1994. But that's when this big revival came around. And so when I think of the term vintage style, I think generally between 1930s and really 1950s, but I'll throw in the 1960s in there as well, because I know a lot of people. So within the vintage community now, where I sit right now in the year 2021, that is what I consider the vintage community, is people who tend to dress in anything from the 1930s to the 1960s. So that is my frame of reference. So when I'm searching on Pinterest, on TikTok, on Instagram, any of the social media, and I'm searching for vintage, whether it's I'm actually searching for a vintage garment, I'm looking for inspiration, I'm looking for other people to follow, and I type in vintage, and I'm seeing these people who are, dressing in 80s and 90s clothing and using that term vintage, it is really frustrating to me. But they're not wrong. And that's even more frustrating to me. So I can't rightfully be angry. I can't rightfully be frustrated because they're correct in that. So my frustration with this is that, the term vintage stays the same. It means the same, but every decade it alters. It moves one more decade over. So, now it is 2021. So technically all of the 1920 stuff is now considered antique. And you know what? We are 9 years away from the 1930 stuff to become antique. And then we're going to add in 2010 as we're going to usher in 2010 into the vintage definition. Okay, so why does this matter? Why does this even matter? So for anybody who's coming into this style, I'm going to go ahead and just call it classic style, just so I can define it a little bit better. Anybody who's wanting to start dressing in this classic style, 1930s, 40s, 50s, whatever, it can be very confusing to them when they start to search for things, when they're looking on Pinterest, they're looking on Instagram, and they're typing in the term vintage, and they're getting, 80s, 90s stuff as well. Now, for most people, they can discern the difference between the styles. But when you're just getting bogged down with that, when you're getting this like massive amount of stuff that you have to weed through, it's really frustrating and it can be very tiring. Now, of course, anybody can specifically type in 1930 style, 1940 style, and that's fine. But, what if you don't know? What if you don't know that those are, you don't know the differences between those two eras? You don't know the looks. You don't know the differences between 1940s and 1950s. And you're just wanting this general term. You're wanting to find people to follow. You're wanting to find inspiration in that way. So you're typing in the word that you know as vintage, but it's not spitting out the results that you want, and you get frustrated with it, and then you may walk away. But the fact is that search result isn't wrong, because vintage does encompass this whole, from the 1930s to the 2000s. So it can be really frustrating on that end. The part that really bothers me is when people are using the term vintage when they really mean retro, or when they really should be using the word retro. And I see this happening in two ways. One is totally excusable and absolutely understandable. It's just, pure ignorance. People don't know. They're using the term vintage because, again, they believe that it's a style. They don't really understand what it truly means, and that's fine. That can be remedied. That can be educated on. You can find out. You can understand what it means. The second one is a little bit more insidious, and that is people who are purposefully using the term vintage because it's a buzzword, because it is a searchable term, and they're being unethical in using that term as a hashtag in their tag words, in their keywords, and they're using it because they know that it's going to get likes, it's going to get searched, but it has nothing to do with vintage. Or it really should be more on the retro side. And so again, they're diluting the term vintage because they're using the word that, it may be vintage adjacent, it may be what they call vintage style, but it really isn't vintage. And it isn't even, in the classic sense of the word vintage. What they're doing, especially with brands and clothing brands that are using the term vintage when they really mean retro, that can be very confusing to people that are just starting out in this, because they don't know that there's a difference and that the quality is going to be different, the look is going to be different, and it can be very confusing, and it's really frustrating to me to see. And this is something that I definitely noticed so far on TikTok is, people use hashtags or sounds or, the vocals or trends or whatever, just to get likes and just to get their name out there, when that hashtag has nothing to do with whatever the content they're creating. But because it's a buzzword and it's something that is used and searched for, they put that hashtag in there so they can get bumped up. And that is really frustrating. So I know, again, this is kind of a rant, and I apologize. You are in my brain, and I'm sorry. I don't really know if I have a conclusion or a solution to this. It's just something that I have been noticing for a long time. My friend Christina, the Ire Effect, she actually had spoken a little bit about this, similarly about the word plus size. And I noticed that same thing. She was looking for something online, and somebody had put the term plus size for a dress, and it was a 26-inch waist on the dress. That is not plus size. But they use the term because it's a searchable term. It's a buzzword. It's something that people are really searching for. And so I feel a very similar thing is happening with the term vintage. And because the parameters of the vintage world are changing, I would love to know, like, do we want to come up with, do we even want to come up with a new term that really encompasses more our style of vintage, the classic type vintage? I don't like the word classic. It feels very weird to me. It feels very, I don't know. It's icky, but it's the only word that's coming to mind right now to use. So, not in an exclusionary way. I certainly don't want to exclude anybody who, who wants to dress in 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s style. And that's not at all what I'm trying to convey at all. I think it's more for me in the searching aspect of, searching for other people that are within this same style that I'm looking for. I mean, I don't have any issues with anybody who's wearing 60s, 70s, 80s style. It's not my style, and it's not the content that I'm searching for. I'm searching for people who are, who want to dress in 1920s, 30s, 40s, and sometimes 50s style. That's what I'm looking for. And I guess I'm looking for a term that better encompasses that, rather than just saying vintage, because that no longer serves us the way that it did when I was starting out. When I was starting out, that's what vintage meant. Vintage meant, at my time, it was like 40s and 50s. That's it. Even though it encompassed its 60s and 70s, there weren't really many people in the 80s and 90s that were wanting to do 60s and 70s style. So our definition, what it encompassed, what it served us then, is no longer serving us. So I want to hear from you guys. I want to know, like, is this a frustration that you have been having too? Do you notice this? Is it just me? Is it my crazy mind? I, think too much. I work in marketing and I work in social media management. So a lot of these hashtags, a lot of these search terms and keywords and stuff, it's really important to me and my clients. So this is something that is really important to me. And also being a content creator, I want to make sure that my fans, my clients, and my followers are searching the right things to find me. And I think that's really important. It's within the, I practice ethical marketing. So I would never want to put myself out there or use search terms or keywords or whatever that didn't mean anything to me just to try to get new followers, because I want people to follow me because they like my content, because the style that I am portraying is what they're looking for. I don't want people just to, I don't want just all the likes just because that's, I want a bunch of followers. I want quality followers. I want people who want to follow me for me and my content. So, again, this is why I'm a little bit more passionate about it. And you know what? Maybe it's not that important to anybody else but me, and that's fine. But please tell me, like, is this something that you have been finding, that you have been struggling with as far as your search terms when you're on social media, when you're on Pinterest, when you're looking for things? Are you finding the same thing, that you're finding the term vintage is so broad at this point that it's not encompassing what you're searching for? And also, are you noticing that using the term vintage when people really should be using the term retro is really frustrating, because you're not finding the things that you are actually searching for? So yeah, I kind of want to start a conversation. I know it's a little hard. I'm on YouTube. This is a one-sided conversation, but you know what? We've got a comment section here. You go ahead and put all of those comments down in the comments below. Send me an email, send me a message on Instagram, whatever. Let's talk about this. Let's see, is this something do we want to collectively come up with a new term that better describes our style? because I'm afraid that vintage just isn't cutting it anymore. And it's not for any fault of ours or whatever. It's just simply because every decade enters in a new decade of what is considered vintage, and it's just going to start getting flooded within the the search terms and the hashtags and all of that stuff. So for those of you who stick to a specific era, I think it's a lot easier for you guys, because all you have to do is put 50s style, 40s style, 30s style, whatever, and that's super easy. And that does make for, much, much easier searching. But for those of us who cross over in different eras, or just simply want to kind of broaden that within certain parameters, it can be really frustrating. And so, yeah, it could just be me. This could just be a full-on strange rant, and I'm okay with that. It's fine. I got it off my chest, and I want to hear from you. So let me know your thoughts on any of this, or if you have a different perspective. If I'm completely off base for any of this, any of my frustration, I would love, love, love to hear from you. So yeah, that's all for now. I think I hope that you won't need to get into my head anytime again soon. But if you're interested in following me on TikTok, you can find me at _Glambassador. It's just like my Instagram. And yeah, hopefully I can figure things out a little bit more and start posting some more content on TikTok. It's fun, it's interesting. It has definitely opened my eyes on a lot of things. So we'll see how that goes. But thank you for letting me rant, and I really, really look forward to all of your comments, and hopefully we can have a productive conversation about this. All right, I will see you guys soon. Bye.